Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really dramatic and honestly devastating shift. What happened on the German home front during World War II? Now, if you're working through your IGCSE history revision right now, you already know this is an absolutely crucial topic. We're going to look at how the Nazi regime's initial illusion of, well, total invincibility completely shattered, leaving everyday civilians to deal with the harsh realities of total war, absolute devastation, and incredibly strict control. So let's dive right into this.
To make sure we cover everything you need, we've broken this down into 5 key themes today. First, the war economy shifts. Then, devastation from Allied bombings. Third, rationing and rural struggles. Fourth, women and the Hitler Youth. And finally, number 5, the rise of resistance.
All right, starting us off, Section 1, the war economy shifts. Think back to the early days of the war, roughly 1939 and 1941. The German home front was actually surprisingly insulated. The economy wasn't taking a huge hit, mostly because of Hitler's incredible early military successes. The Nazis were ruthlessly exploiting their conquered territories. To give you an idea, France essentially paid them over 7 billion Reichsmarks in just 2 years, while raw materials were constantly being shipped back to Germany. But there was a stark, hidden reality underpinning all this success: 3 million. By 1941, right at the absolute peak of Nazi dominance, the German war machine was literally being propped up by over 3 million foreign workers doing forced labor inside Germany. It was a total facade, built entirely on exploitation. But as you can guess, that facade just couldn't last forever. As the tide of the war started turning, these immense new pressures completely fractured the German economy by 1942. They found themselves fighting a brutal multi-front war. On top of that, Allied bombings were now actively wiping out their factories and transport systems. And we also have to remember that the horrific systematic running of the concentration camps to execute the final solution was actively draining vital resources away from their actual war effort. Now, in a dark and twisted way, it is impressive that the Nazis actually managed to treble their armament production between 1942 and 1944. But once the Allies landed in Normandy and the Soviets started closing in on Berlin, all those conquered territories were lost. The economic collapse was totally undeniable.
Which brings us to Section 2, devastation from Allied bombings.
Look at this data for a second because it shows an explosive reversal of fortunes. Back in 1940, Britain was definitely taking the brunt of the bombing campaigns, getting hit with nearly 37,000 tons of explosives compared to Germany's 10,000. But fast forward just a few years to 1944, the bombs hitting Britain plummeted while Germany faced a staggering 650,000 tons. Just try to wrap your head around that number. By May 1943, the British were bombing relentlessly by night and the Americans were bombing by day. The sheer scale of destruction raining down on German cities was basically unimaginable.
To really understand the terrifying reality behind those numbers, we need to look at a specific case study, and this is a great one to remember for your exams. I'm talking about the July and August 1943 Hamburg raids. The bombing there was so unbelievably intense that 60% of the entire city was just wiped off the map, gone. 300,000 houses were destroyed, and tragically, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people lost their lives. The effect this kind of terror bombing had on civilian morale was catastrophic. People were completely traumatized, panic set in, and the chaos was so severe that some people were even trampled to death inside the bomb shelters by their own terrified neighbors.
And I think this primary source perfectly captures the heavy psychological toll of all that. This is a diary entry from Mathilde Wolff-Monkeberg, a housewife living in Hamburg in 1943. After the devastating military surrender at Stalingrad earlier that year and living through these relentless bombings, she wrote that people were, quote, curiously apathetic and dull. She literally saw despair written on their faces. The initial shock had worn off, and what replaced it was this silent, exhausted trauma. People just started tolerating their misery and actually forgot that a normal life had ever existed.
Moving on, let's look at Section 3, rationing and rural struggles.
The Nazi regime knew very well that civilian morale depended on food. They had learned a really hard lesson from the severe shortages back in the First World War, and they were desperate to not repeat that mistake. And, well, early on, they succeeded. In 1939, the meat ration was a pretty comfortable 700 grams per person per week. But that system completely unraveled as the war dragged to a close. By 1945, that same ration had plummeted to just 250 grams.
And that drop in rations meant people became incredibly desperate for sustenance. Okay, this is one of those surreal details of history you literally can't make up. During the winter of 1943, a massive portion of the Berlin Zoo was destroyed by bombs, and sadly, many animals were killed. In a really desperate twist, Berliners actually resorted to eating the zoo animals. Diners figured out that crocodile tail tasted a bit like chicken if you cooked it long enough, and things like buffalo, antelope, and bear hams actually became highly sought-after commodities. Eventually, as official rationing completely failed, a massive black market stepped in to supply basic food items.
Now, the struggle wasn't contained to just the big cities. The countryside was completely transformed too. Before 1939, the Nazis had heavily promised to protect traditional rural German life. Agricultural work was supposed to be secure and respected, but wartime reality totally destroyed that promise. Small villages suddenly had to absorb massive influxes of evacuees and refugees fleeing the bombed-out cities. Village populations skyrocketed overnight, housing ran out, and locals were forced by the state to share their homes with strangers. By 1944, knowing the war was a lost cause, a lot of these villagers just stopped supporting the Third Reich entirely. They started openly defying officials and secretly hoarding the food they grew instead of giving it to the government.
Let's shift our focus a bit to Section 4, Women and the Hitler Youth.
So, ideologically, the Nazis were obsessed with keeping women at home. Their original policy was entirely focused on increasing the birth rate of so-called pure stock Germans. But the reality of total war, the horrific human losses on the front lines, and the incredibly severe labor shortages at home forced a complete reversal of that policy. The regime suddenly found itself desperately trying to incentivize women to go back to work in the munitions factories and on the railways. But frankly, it was too little, too late. The exhausting physical labor, combined with the food shortages, the constant terror of the bombing raids, and the endless worry for their husbands and sons at the front, led to a really tragic deterioration of women's public health across the board.
And meanwhile, the children of Germany were basically thrust right into adult roles. Members of the Hitler Youth found themselves holding the entire domestic front together. The organization was put in charge of massive child evacuation programs, sending younger kids off to supposedly safer areas like Austria and Bavaria, which, as you can imagine, was a terrible emotional ordeal for families being separated. Teenage boys were assigned incredibly dangerous tasks, guiding people through the rubble during blackouts, delivering mail, and literally running fire services in burning cities. Girls were mobilized to work in overcapacity hospitals, run kindergartens, and form choirs to entertain wounded soldiers. Normal childhood, as they knew it, was effectively canceled.
This finally brings us to our last theme today, Section 5, the rise of resistance. You know, as the facade of the home front crumbled, active resistance naturally grew bolder. Opposition really sparked among youth groups first, especially as horrifying rumors about the concentration camps, mass murder, and the euthanasia programs started leaking out to the public. In August 1942, a group of young Jewish activists led by Herbert Baum resorted to direct action, setting fire to a Nazi exhibition in Berlin. They were quickly caught and brutally executed. Then, in February 1943, we see a massive rise in student resistance. And eventually, by July 1944, the opposition went all the way up to the highest ranks of the military, culminating in a direct assassination attempt on Hitler himself.
For your exams, you absolutely must know specific examples of this resistance, and the White Rose movement is a huge one. This was an incredibly courageous underground group made up of about 15 students at Munich University, prominently led by a brother and sister duo, Hans and Sophie Scholl. They covertly distributed leaflets that openly encouraged young Germans to wake up and fight back against the Nazi regime. Tragically, on February 18, 1943, the Scholls were caught, intensely interrogated for 3 days, and swiftly executed. But their bravery remains as powerful, lasting testament to the internal defiance against Hitler.
But the regime's most vicious retaliation, the moment the terror really peaked, came after the events of July 1944. A senior army officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg managed to plant a bomb in a conference room being used by Hitler. The bomb went off, killing 4 people, but Hitler miraculously survived with only minor injuries. In response, the Nazi terror apparatus just went into absolute overdrive. Over 5,000 people who were even remotely connected to the conspirators were barbarically executed. The regime knew it was collapsing, and it violently lashed out against its own people in its final days. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to step back and synthesize all these complex moving parts we've just looked at. The German home front started as this carefully constructed facade of prosperity, but it slowly degraded into a reality of absolute terror and ruin. I want to leave you with this absolutely crucial historical question to consider for your revision. Which factor, the sheer physical devastation of the Allied bombing, the slow starvation of extreme rationing, or the total economic collapse, do you think ultimately have the greatest impact on breaking German civilian morale? Think about how these elements fed into one another. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this intense chapter of history, and definitely keep this question in the back of your mind as you continue studying.